September 2024. Social media exploded. The Hells Angels were riding to Colorado to destroy a Venezuelan gang. Millions believed it. It was entirely false. But the real story, what these two criminal worlds actually mean to each other, is far more disturbing. The story that broke the internet and why it wasn't true. September 2024. Aurora, Colorado had been dominating the national news cycle for weeks. Videos circulated showing hooded men with rifles moving through apartment hallways. Politicians on both sides of the immigration debate had seized on the footage. The phrase Venezuelan gang takeover had entered the political bloodstream and was being repeated from cable news panels to the floor of the United States Senate. And then, in the middle of all of it, something else went viral. Videos appeared on Instagram, TikTok, X, and Facebook, showing long columns of motorcycles on American highways, dozens of riders in tight formation, moving fast, moving with purpose. The caption that attached itself to those videos was the same across every platform. The Hells Angels were heading to Colorado to deal with the Venezuelan gangs. The Mongols were with them, the outlaws too. Three of the most feared outlaw motorcycle clubs in America riding together to take care of what the government wouldn't. The comment sections across every platform filled within hours. The share counts climbed into the millions. People who had never paid attention to motorcycle clubs, who couldn't have named a single Hells Angels chapter city, were sharing the videos with the kind of urgency that content about vigilante justice has always produced in moments when institutional trust has collapsed. It was the story millions of people wanted to be true, and it was completely false. Every piece of it. The first video, the one that launched the entire narrative, was traced back to a 2010 upload by the Mongols Motorcycle Club. The bikers in that footage were not heading to Colorado. They were not responding to any gang crisis. They had been riding somewhere else entirely, 14 years before the story that attached itself to them was written. The second video, the one showing 4 lanes of motorcyclists moving in disciplined formation, the one that looked most like an army on the move, was identified by fact-checkers at X itself, underneath the video, in text that the people sharing the post overwhelmingly did not read. The text said, "This video does not show Hells Angels riding to Aurora, Colorado to fight against Venezuelan gang members. They are Brazilian bikers being escorted by the São Paulo State Highway Police." On the 4th of September 2024, the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club issued a statement through their Rocky Mountain Charter's Instagram account. The language was uncharacteristically diplomatic for an organization that has historically communicated its positions through other means. A social media rumor claiming that the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club is headed to Aurora, Colorado, to violently confront Venezuelan immigrants has gone viral, the statement read. The HAMC strongly denies the foundation and validity of these absolutely ridiculous and false claims. The HAMC does not involve itself in political issues outside of motorcycling and takes no stance on the issue of immigration or the presidential election. Motorcycle clubs ride in packs every day, in every corner of America. There is nothing unique about such imagery. The Aurora Police Department confirmed independently that no Hells Angels presence had materialized. The interim police chief, Heather Morris, had already stated that officers investigating the apartment complex at the center of the alleged gang takeover The Edge at the Lowry at 1218 Dallas Street had found no evidence of a gang takeover. "We've been talking to the residents here and learning from them to find out what exactly is going on," Morris told Denver 7. "And there's definitely a different picture. I'm not saying that there's not gang members that don't live in this community. But what we're learning out here is that gang members have not taken over this complex. There were gang members who lived in the building. There was no gang control of the building." The gap between what the viral story described and what law enforcement found on the ground was the gap between political myth-making and documented reality. But here is what the viral moment revealed, regardless of its falsity. Millions of people immediately believed it, not because they were credulous or uninformed, but because the story was emotionally coherent in a way that real stories often aren't. The Hells Angels, in the public imagination, were precisely the kind of organization that would ride into a crisis that the government had failed to handle. Rough, organized, decisive, unafraid of consequences. And the Venezuelan gang, Tren de Aragua, had been built up in the political conversation into precisely the kind of organization that would require that response military in its organization, territorial in its ambitions, beyond the reach of normal law enforcement. The collision of those two imaginary forces was so satisfying as a story that the evidence barely slowed it down. What was really happening in Aurora, in the broader relationship between the Hells Angels and the Venezuelan criminal world, and in the actual documented operations of Tren de Aragua inside the United States, was a different story entirely. More complicated, less satisfying, and in some ways more disturbing precisely because it resisted the clean narrative the viral moment had offered. There is one more element of the Aurora story worth examining, because it reveals something specific about how misinformation functions when it serves a political purpose. The mayor of Aurora, Mike Kaufman, had been among the most prominent political voices describing the situation as a gang takeover. He gave television interviews. He used the phrase "taken over" to describe what was happening in his city. The Aurora Police Department, in its own statements, directly contradicted the mayor's characterization. Police Chief Morris said that officers had found residents living normally in the buildings, that there were gang members present, but no evidence of gang control. Two arms of the same municipal government were telling two different stories about the same building in the same week. The national political apparatus, specifically the 2024 presidential campaign, had seized on Aurora as evidence for a broader argument about immigration policy and border security. In that context, the accuracy of the takeover characterization was less relevant than its political utility. Tren de Aragua had become a political symbol in the same way that MS-13 had become one in 2016, a specific gang name attached to a broader argument about immigration, crime, and national security, in ways that both acknowledged some real criminal activity and significantly distorted its scale, organization, and meaning. The Hells Angels' viral appearance in that story was the final layer of political theater, American vigilante heroes responding to a crisis that institutions had failed to address, riding to restore order. That none of it was real did not stop it from shaping the political conversation for weeks. What Tren de Aragua actually is, before you can understand the relationship between the Hells Angels and Venezuela's most significant criminal export, you have to understand what Tren de Aragua actually is, not the political version, not the cable news version, the documented version, assembled from federal court records, DEA intelligence assessments, State Department designations, and the work of investigative journalists who spent years covering the organization before it became a talking point in an American presidential election. Tren de Aragua, Spanish for the Aragua train, a name likely derived from a labor union connected to an unfinished railway project in the Venezuelan state of Aragua, was founded in 2014. Not in a cartel compound, not by a crime family with generational roots in the narcotics trade, in a prison, specifically in the Tocaron Penitentiary, a state correctional facility in central Venezuela that had, under the policy framework of the Venezuelan government, been effectively handed over to its own inmates to manage. The man who built Tren de Aragua was named Héctor Rustenford Guerrero Flores, known universally as Niño Guerrero, Kid Warrior in English. He was serving a 17-year sentence for murder and drug trafficking. From inside Tocaron, he built something that had no direct precedent in Latin American organized crime, a prison that functioned as a sovereign criminal state. The Venezuelan government's unofficial policy of allowing prison brains, criminal bosses, to police their own facilities had given men like Guerrero a gift, authority without accountability. Inside Tocaron, that authority produced something that required seeing to believe. The prison Guerrero controlled was not a conventional correctional facility by the time Tren de Aragua was finished building it. Inside its walls, the gang constructed a zoo with exotic animals, a swimming pool, a nightclub, a casino, a restaurant, a bar. The men Guerrero controlled were not living in cells as much as operating within a fortified compound that happened to be located inside a prison, a compound from which the gang's leader directed criminal operations across multiple Venezuelan states and, eventually, multiple countries. The Venezuelan government's tolerance of this arrangement was documented, broadly acknowledged, and never meaningfully explained. From the prison, Tren de Aragua expanded its criminal portfolio across Venezuela. The original income streams, extortion of inmates, drug trafficking within the facility, gave way to something more diverse and more durable: kidnapping, human trafficking for sexual exploitation, migrant smuggling, illegal mining, cybercrime, retail drug distribution, contraband. The gang also established what its investigators described as a public-facing non-profit organization, Somos El Barrio (JK). We are the neighborhood JK, that provided services in communities the gang controlled, enforced rules, and functioned as a parallel government in areas where the Venezuelan state had effectively stopped operating. In Venezuela's so-called peace zones, where the central government had agreed to limit police operations as long as local groups kept visible crime down, Tren de Aragua filled the institutional vacuum completely. The expansion beyond Venezuela's borders accelerated around 2018, when the gang began establishing operations on the Venezuela-Colombia border. The timing was not coincidental. Venezuela's economic collapse under the combined weight of mismanagement, sanctions, and the collapse of oil revenue had produced the largest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere's recent history. More than 7 million Venezuelans had left the country by the mid-2020s. Tren de Aragua followed the migration routes not because its members were refugees, though some were, but because those routes were profitable. Migrants moving through Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Chile were vulnerable. They were cash poor, document poor, and largely unable to access formal legal protection. The gang established operations along every major migration corridor, charging for passage, directing women into forced prostitution through a debt bondage model that it had refined in Colombia and eventually brought to multiple countries, and building local criminal cells that adapted the Tren de Aragua model to whatever conditions they found. In July 2024, the U.S. Treasury Department officially designated Tren de Aragua as a transnational criminal organization. In September 2024, the State Department announced a $12 million reward for information leading to the arrest of 3 of the gang's senior leaders. In February 2025, the U.S. State Department designated the gang a foreign terrorist organization, a designation with significant legal consequences for anyone found to be providing material support to its operations. In January 2025, former Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro himself was indicted in a United States federal court, charged with partnering with Tren de Aragua and its leadership to distribute narcotics into the United States. In September 2023, Venezuelan security forces stormed the Tocaron prison and reclaimed it. The physical structure that had served as Tren de Aragua's headquarters was dismantled, but the leadership had received advance warning and escaped. The gang survived the loss of its home base because it had, by that point, built enough external cells, enough international operations, and enough decentralized structure to continue functioning without it. Tocaron was gone. The organization it had produced was not. What happened inside Tocaron between 2014 and 2023 was the product of a specific and well-documented failure of Venezuelan state governance. The country's prison system had, under the policy framework developed through the Chavez era and continued under Maduro, devolved responsibility for internal prison management to the prains, the inmate bosses who controlled criminal hierarchies inside the facilities. The logic, such as it was that allowing the criminal organizations to police themselves would reduce visible violence inside the prisons and free the state from the cost of maintaining genuine institutional control. What it produced instead was the systematic transfer of criminal infrastructure, revenue, and organizational capacity from the state to the criminal organizations that the state had effectively deputized. Guerrero took everything the devolution offered and built it into something unprecedented. The zoo inside Tocaron's walls was not a vanity project. It was a statement to inmates, to rival criminal organizations, to the Venezuelan government, and to the outside world about who held power. A man who could construct a zoo inside a state prison, complete with exotic animals and maintained with criminal revenue, was a man the state had no meaningful power over. The swimming pool, the nightclub, the casino, the restaurant, each one was evidence of the same proposition. The Venezuelan government had handed Guerrero a fortress and called it a prison. He ran it accordingly. The expansion beyond Venezuela's borders, when it came, was not planned in the sense that a legitimate corporation plans international expansion. It followed the crisis. More than 7 million Venezuelans had left the country by the mid-2020s, the largest displacement crisis in Latin American history, the largest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere at that point since the Haitian Revolution. Tren de Aragua followed the migration routes because the migration routes were where the vulnerable people were, and vulnerable people were the organization's primary operational resource. They could be extorted. They could be trafficked. They could be recruited into criminal operations in new countries where they had no legal standing, no social connections, and no alternative to whatever the gang offered. The gang turned the Venezuelan refugee crisis into a business model. The truth about Tren de Aragua in America. The political version of Tren de Aragua's American presence was a military-scale invasion organized, centrally directed, spreading across dozens of states with the operational discipline of a cartel. The documented reality was more complicated, more fragmented, and in some ways more troubling for reasons that the political narrative missed entirely. By early 2025, law enforcement had identified suspected Tren de Aragua members in at least 14 American states. The crimes those members were accused of ranged significantly in scale and organization: sex trafficking in Nashville, Tennessee, ATM theft in New York, a contract killing in Miami, low-level weapons dealing in Denver, a jewelry store heist in Colorado where the suspects were filmed on surveillance cameras pulling guns and pistol-whipping 2 women before escaping, the shooting of 2 New York City police officers, an incident that drew national attention and was cited repeatedly by federal officials as evidence of the gang's presence and danger, the killing of a former Venezuelan police officer in Florida, the murder of Laken Riley, a 22-year-old Georgia nursing student killed in February 2024 by a Venezuelan man, Jose Ibarra, who was convicted of murder and kidnapping and sentenced to life in prison. These were real crimes committed by real people with real documented connections to Venezuelan criminal networks. What they were not, according to the assessment of the FBI, independent criminologists, and the police departments in the cities where the crimes occurred, was evidence of a coordinated, centrally directed national operation with the kind of command and control structure that the political narrative implied. The FBI's January 2024 confirmation that the gang was operating in the United States was carefully worded: a presence, not a takeover; a criminal network, not an occupying force. The New York Police Department reported that suspected Tren de Aragua members in their city were largely focused on phone snatching and retail theft, serious crimes, crimes that harm real people, but not the operations of a military-scale transnational organization with a national strategic agenda. In Aurora, as the police chief repeatedly stated, despite being contradicted by politicians at the national level who had not visited the scene, there were gang members present in certain apartment complexes. There was no gang takeover of those buildings. The more accurate picture was described by sociologists who had spent decades studying gang formation and the sociology of criminal migration. Tren de Aragua had provided a model, a brand, and in some cases, a genuine organizational network. Individual criminals, some with verified connections to the gang's Venezuelan command structure, others simply deploying the gang's name and methods without formal membership, were operating across the United States in the way that criminal populations have always operated when they arrive in new environments. Organized enough to be dangerous, disorganized enough to defy the invasion narrative. And America's quarterly analysis concluded that the gang's reach in the United States was significantly exaggerated, that genuinely organized cells with real command and control connections to Venezuelan leadership were concentrated in a handful of states. The rest of the national footprint was, in significant part, the result of individual Venezuelan criminals applying the Tren de Aragua model independently, sometimes claiming gang affiliation as a form of intimidation or recruitment without the organizational backing that affiliation implied. Experts on gang formation had seen this pattern before. In El Salvador in the 1990s, MS-13 had started as a localized Los Angeles street gang and become, through deportation and the criminal networks that connected deportees across borders, a transnational organization. The trajectory was familiar. the speed and the political intensity surrounding it were not. This distinction mattered enormously for understanding the relationship between Tren de Aragua and the Hells Angels, because the two organizations were not operating in the same world, in the same way, or at the same level of institutional sophistication. How the Hells Angels actually operate their territory. To understand what the Hells Angels' relationship to Tren de Aragua actually was, as opposed to what social media imagined it to be, you have to understand how the Hells Angels' territorial system works, because that system is the lens through which the club evaluates every new criminal organization that enters its geography. And Tren de Aragua was no different from the dozens of other organizations the Angels had evaluated, negotiated with, absorbed, or eliminated across 7 decades of territorial management. The Hells Angels operate what investigators and journalists have consistently described as a franchise model. The comparison to a corporation is not metaphorical, it is structural. Each chapter controls a defined geographic territory. The chapter holds the exclusive right to conduct criminal operations in that territory, primarily drug distribution, but also extortion, weapons trafficking, prostitution, and whatever other revenue streams the local criminal economy supports. Street-level criminal organizations, smaller clubs, independent dealers, ethnic gangs are permitted to operate within Angels' territory under a specific arrangement. They pay a percentage of their revenue to the chapter that controls the area, the biker tax. In Canada, investigators have documented the figure at around 10%. In American markets, the percentages vary by territory and by the relative power of the parties negotiating. This system works because everyone in the criminal ecosystem respects it, or more precisely, because the cost of not respecting it is made sufficiently clear. The Hells Angels have responded to territorial challenges across their entire history in ways that left the nature of the response unmistakable. When 3 outlaws showed up uninvited at a Hells Angels party in New York on New Year's Eve, 1973, 2 of the 3 were taken to a construction site and killed execution-style. That single event ignited a biker war between the Angels and the Outlaws that has never formally ended. When the ATF ran Operation Black Biscuit in Phoenix, and an undercover operative believed by the Angels to be a rival encroaching on their territory was identified, a senior chapter member allegedly assembled veteran enforcers to eliminate the perceived threat before the operation was shut down. The pattern is consistent across geography and across decades. Define the territory, communicate the definition, and enforce violations with organized violence. What this means for any new criminal organization entering Angels-controlled geography is specific and well documented. You have 3 options. You can approach the Angels, acknowledge the territorial arrangement, pay the percentage, and operate as a subordinate enterprise under the franchise structure. Many organizations across the country and across the world have chosen this option. It is the least costly path, and it is the one the Angels prefer, because it generates revenue without generating the conflict that attracts federal attention. You can attempt to operate without acknowledging the arrangement and accept the escalating consequences. Or you can build sufficient organizational power to contest the territory, which requires a conflict the Angels have historically been very willing to have, and which almost always ends badly for the challenger. The Denver Hells Angels chapter, in the same geographic area as the Aurora situation, had its own documented federal story. A 5-month investigation in 2019 involving 11 state and federal law enforcement agencies, launched after a former HAMS member began cooperating with investigators, produced evidence of the Denver chapter's alleged involvement in interstate drug trafficking, gun running, prostitution, and money laundering. One defendant was killed in a shootout with a rival motorcycle gang before he could stand trial. The chapter that the viral narrative cast as a potential savior of Aurora from Venezuelan gangs was itself the subject of a major federal racketeering investigation in the same city, in the same period, involving the same basic criminal infrastructure that made the Angels dangerous in the first place. The question that the viral story asked, would the Angels ride to confront the Venezuelan gang, was the wrong question. The right questions were more structural. Had Tren de Aragua's operations in Angels territory been noticed? Had the franchise arrangement been communicated? Was the Venezuelan gang operating with knowledge of and in relation to the Angels' territorial authority? Those questions did not have public answers in September 2024, but they were the questions that actually mattered to both organizations. The Latin America dimension, where they actually share space. While the viral story focused on a confrontation that never happened in Colorado, the real geographic overlap between the Hells Angels and Tren de Aragua was developing in Latin America, and it was far more significant, far more documented, and far more consequential for understanding the relationship between the two organizations. The Hells Angels had been expanding into Latin America for years before Tren de Aragua became a political story in the United States. In Chile, the club established chapters that were eventually targeted by the Chilean investigations police in operations that dismantled their local leadership, seized significant weapons and drug-producing materials, and effectively ended the Angels' Chilean presence. In Mexico, the club developed working relationships with the Sinaloa cartel and other major trafficking organizations, and relationships that also attracted the attention of Mexican and American counter-narcotics operations and produced arrests and deaths on the Angels' side. In Brazil, the club developed ties with local criminal organizations, including the Rising Devils, a support club. In Colombia, the Angels moved through a landscape where the ELN, the Clan del Golfo, and multiple other armed organizations had already divided the criminal territory. Tren de Aragua was expanding through the same geography. Its operations in Colombia, Peru, Chile, Ecuador, and Brazil were documented by the same law enforcement agencies tracking the Angels' Latin American expansion. In Chile, specifically, one of the few countries where both organizations had documented significant operations, the two criminal worlds were operating in proximity to criminal markets that neither could fully control. The analysis published by Real Clear World in March 2025 identified what it called the Angels' strategic dilemma in Latin America explicitly. The Hells Angels, despite their connections to dozens of criminal organizations and their influence in the drug trade and prostitution networks, tend to stay relatively local in their activities. Expanding to Latin America and running regional or global criminal operations brings them a slew of potential rewards, but not without significant risk and threats. In Chile and Mexico, the state had already responded with force to the Angels' new settlements. In Mexico, a drug trafficker with Hells Angels connections was killed in a targeted hit by a Mexican cartel in Playa del Carmen in 2024. The mega cartels growing across Latin America, the Sinaloa cartel, Brazil's first capital command, the Red Command, and Tren de Aragua were identified by the same analysis as the primary competitive challenge the Angels faced in the region. The Angels were not, in Latin America, the dominant organization. They were a sophisticated but relatively small player in a criminal landscape where organizations that had been building for decades had established territorial control the Angels could not simply override. Tren de Aragua, meanwhile, was identified as one of the mega cartels growing, increasingly sophisticated, filling the institutional vacuum that Venezuelan state collapse had created across the Western Hemisphere. The two organizations were not simply coexisting in the same geography. They were competing, directly or indirectly, for the same criminal markets, drug distribution corridors, human trafficking routes, extortion territories in countries where neither had the undisputed dominance that the Angels maintained in their American home territories. The Hells Angels' arrival in Latin America was not, from the club's perspective, a departure from their established model. It was an extension of it. The same franchise structure that governed the club's American and European operations was applied to the Latin American markets. Establish a chapter, define the territory, build relationships with the dominant local criminal organizations, collect the tax from subordinate operations, and enforce the structure through the credible threat of organized violence. The execution was more difficult in Latin American countries with different law enforcement frameworks, different criminal ecosystems, and different political environments than the club had navigated in North America and Europe. But the model was the same. Chile was the most instructive case. The Angels established chapters there and built connections to local criminal organizations, including the Vampiros. Chilean authorities responded with a directness that surprised the club. The Chilean investigations police conducted operations that the Real Clear World analysis described as having essentially killed the entirety of the club. gangs' presence in the country, detaining their top leaders, seizing significant weaponry and drug-producing material, and banning their presence on social media. The Angels' Chilean operation, built on the same model that had survived decades of North American and European prosecution, was dismantled with a speed that illustrated a specific point about the franchise model's limits. It had been optimized for operating in legal and political environments the club knew. Latin American legal environments, with different standards, different resources, and different institutional relationships, were less predictable. In Mexico, the Angels developed relationships with the Sinaloa cartel and other trafficking organizations, and those relationships generated both revenue and retaliation. The 2024 killing of a drug trafficker linked to the Hells Angels in Playa del Carmen, a targeted hit by a Mexican cartel in a tourist area, in broad public view, illustrated the specific risk that Latin American expansion introduced. Mexican cartels operated with a willingness to kill publicly that the Angels had always managed to avoid in their home territories. Attracting the attention of an organization that used that willingness as a routine competitive tool was a qualitatively different risk than the federal prosecutions the Angels had survived at home. Tren de Aragua's operations in the same Latin American geography added another dimension to the Angels' strategic challenge. In countries where both organizations were operating, the Angels were not the dominant force they were in California or Colorado. They were a sophisticated entrant in a criminal landscape where organizations with deeper local roots, larger memberships, and greater willingness to use visible violence held the structural advantages. Tren de Aragua, following Venezuelan migration routes through Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Chile, and Brazil, was building those same kinds of local routes in real time, adapting its operations to local conditions, building relationships with local criminal organizations, and establishing the kind of presence that the Angels, as relative newcomers to the region, had not yet achieved. The drug market question: who controls what? The most direct operational tension between the Hells Angels and Tren de Aragua was not ideological. It was not territorial in the political sense that the viral story implied. It was economic. Both organizations needed the same thing: access to drug distribution markets. And in the American cities, where both had documented operations, those markets overlapped in ways that criminal organizations have historically resolved through either negotiation or violence. The Hells Angels' primary drug was methamphetamine, though the club's documented operations also included cocaine, heroin, and marijuana, depending on the chapter and the region. The club manufactured methamphetamine. At-scale ATF investigations had documented production operations connected to the Angels in multiple states over multiple decades and distributed it through the franchise network that the production operations club's territorial structure supported. The Angels had working relationships with the Mexican cartels that controlled the primary supply chains for methamphetamine and cocaine into the United States, and in some territories, those relationships gave the Angels preferred access to product at pricing that independent dealers could not match. This was the structural advantage that the franchise model produced: the ability to purchase at cartel prices, distribute through a disciplined network, and collect both the margin on drug sales and the tax on every independent operation working in the same territory. Tren de Aragua's drug portfolio was different in emphasis and in scale. The U.S. Treasury Department's July 2024 designation described the gang's primary criminal activities as human smuggling and exploitation of vulnerable migrants, with additional revenue from drug trafficking, including cocaine and MDMA. The gang's drug trafficking model, as documented in Latin America, was less about controlling large distribution networks with cartel-level supply chains and more about exploiting the migrant populations it controlled for retail-level distribution using the human trafficking operations, both an income source and a distribution workforce, and moving drugs through the same smuggling corridors it used for people. The difference in scale and sophistication was real and significant. The Angels operated what investigators described in Canada as a criminal corporation, covering entire provinces, and in the United States as an enterprise that the Justice Department had spent decades trying to prosecute at the RICO. Two-level. Tren de Aragua operated what law enforcement described as a decentralized, adaptable network of local cells that could exploit whatever criminal market they found without requiring the top-down coordination that the Angels franchise model demanded. At the street level, both organizations were selling drugs. At the institutional level, they were operating at different points in the same supply chain, with different organizational models and different relationships to the federal attention that drug trafficking inevitably generated. What made them competitors in practical terms was geography and customers. In American cities where both operated, the drug markets were finite. Market share that Tren de Aragua's cells captured was, in principle, market share that the Angels franchise network had previously held or would otherwise compete for. The question of how that competition was resolved, through informal coexistence, through some version of the territorial arrangement the Angels imposed on other criminal organizations, or through the kind of violence that the Angels had historically used to settle territorial disputes, was not answered publicly by the events of September 2024. What the public got instead was the viral story. What the criminal world was working out in the geography of American cities where both organizations had documented operations was the actual answer. What made the economic competition between the two organizations particularly significant was the specific geography of the cities where both had documented operations. Colorado was not a random data point. The Denver metropolitan area was one of the Hells Angels' established American territories. The chapter there was not a recent arrival, but a mature criminal operation with established supplier relationships, distribution networks, and the kind of law enforcement familiarity that comes from years of operating in the same geography. The arrival of Tren de Aragua cells in the same geography was not an abstraction. It was a documented intrusion into a specific criminal market that the Angels regarded as theirs in the specific sense that outlaw motorcycle clubs use that word. The Angels had resolved similar intrusions before through the same basic process: establish contact, communicate the territorial arrangement, and either absorb the intruding organization into the franchise structure or eliminate the threat it posed. Whether that process had been initiated in Colorado with respect to Tren de Aragua's cells, whether the conversations that criminal organizations have when they occupy the same territory had occurred, what their outcome was, and what the consequences of that outcome were going to be, was not part of the public record as of September 2024. The viral story provided the public with a satisfying fictional version of that resolution. The actual resolution, if it was occurring, was happening in the spaces where criminal organizations have always resolved their territorial disputes. Off-camera, unreported, and without the participation of anyone inclined to share the details. What the Angels actually fear and what they don't. The viral story of September 2024 was built on a specific premise, that the Hells Angels would be willing to mobilize against Tren de Aragua, either because they feared the Venezuelan gang's territorial challenge or because they were willing to play vigilante in American communities. Both versions of the story assigned to the Angels a specific kind of motivation that the Angels' actual history does not support. The Hells Angels' actual statement made their institutional position clear. They do not involve themselves in political issues. They take no stance on immigration. That statement was issued for public consumption and should be evaluated with the understanding that an organization with the Angels' legal exposure would not voluntarily associate itself with what federal law would characterize as a conspiracy to commit violent crimes against a specific ethnic group in a specific state. The statement was legally prudent, regardless of its accuracy. But it also reflects something real about how the Angels have always operated. The club's violence has been, throughout its documented history, instrumental rather than ideological, business rather than politics, territory rather than principle. From that perspective, the question of whether the Angels feared Tren de Aragua was not about physical confrontation in the street-fighting sense that the viral story implied. The Angels have faced organizations more immediately dangerous than Tren de Aragua's American cells in a direct physical confrontation, the Mongols, who had already taken Southern California from the Angels and held it. The Outlaws, who had bombed Angels' installations, and killed senior members in a war that had run for decades. The bandidos, who had contested the Angels across multiple continents and fought them to a standstill in Scandinavia with military ordnance. Physical courage and the willingness to absorb casualties were not constraints on the Angels' response to any threat. What criminal organizations in the Angels' position historically fear is disruption to the revenue model. An organization that moves into your territory, operates outside the established hierarchy, generates massive federal attention through high-profile violence and political controversy, and refuses to acknowledge the franchise structure that your entire revenue model depends on, is a problem in the specific sense that matters to a criminal enterprise. It draws law enforcement scrutiny to geography you have spent decades carefully managing. It signals to every other criminal organization in your network that the territorial rules are negotiable. It creates the kind of visible criminal chaos in communities where you have operated quietly for years that produces the specific kind of task force investigations that cost you members, chapters, and the kind of institutional continuity that 60 years of survival depends on. Tren de Aragua's American operations, as documented, were generating exactly the kind of federal attention, transnational criminal organization designation, State Department rewards, executive orders, mass deportations, congressional hearings, presidential campaign speeches that the Angels had always managed to minimize through the careful maintenance of their institutional positioning. The Angels had trademarked their logo, they had sued Disney, they had maintained the legal fiction, however thin, that any crimes committed by members were individual rather than organizational. They had avoided the kind of explicit political association that made organizations easy targets for the full weight of federal domestic terrorism statutes rather than just racketeering law. The more Tren de Aragua became a political story, the more it was cited in presidential speeches, the more it appeared in federal designation documents as a terrorist organization, the more it was used to justify immigration enforcement operations that swept up everyone in the same communities where both organizations operated, the more law enforcement heat flowed into exactly the geographic territories where the Angels were also conducting their own criminal enterprise. That heat was the disruption, not a territorial challenge in the outlaw motorcycle club sense. A law enforcement environment made systematically more hostile by the political attention that the Venezuelan gang had attracted. There is something worth saying about the specific nature of the federal attention that Tren de Aragua's political profile generated, because it was qualitatively different from the federal attention that the Angels had spent decades managing. RICO prosecutions, the tool that federal investigators had used against the Angels, most consistently required years of evidence accumulation, informants placed at senior levels of the organization, and the specific legal architecture that the racketeer-influenced and corrupt organization's statute demanded. The Angels had developed institutional responses to RICO investigations over decades. They knew the signature of a long-term undercover operation. They knew what cooperation looked like from the inside. They had legal defense funds, experienced defense attorneys, and the organizational memory of every prosecution that had come before. Foreign terrorist organization designations operated differently. The FTO designation that Tren de Aragua received in February 2025 gave federal prosecutors tools that went beyond RICO tools designed for organizations that posed national security threats rather than purely criminal. Any organization found to be providing material support to an FTO faced criminal exposure under counterterrorism statutes that carried different burdens of proof, different evidentiary standards, and different sentencing frameworks than the drug trafficking and racketeering charges the Angels were accustomed to defending. If any Hells Angels operation was found to have a working relationship with Tren de Aragua, a supply arrangement, a territorial accommodation, any transaction that a federal prosecutor could characterize as material support for a foreign terrorist organization, the legal consequences were categorically different from anything the Angels had previously navigated. That exposure, whether the Angels explicitly calculated it or whether it was simply absorbed into the general institutional wariness that 60 years of federal investigation had produced, was the specific reason the organizational distance from Tren de Aragua was prudent, regardless of any territorial calculation. The Canada dimension, where the pattern is clearest, The most illuminating parallel to the Hells Angels situation with Venezuelan gangs was not happening in Colorado or New York in September 2024. It was happening in Quebec, Canada, where the Angels franchise model was facing the most direct and most documented challenge in the organization's Canadian history, and where the nature of that challenge revealed exactly how the club responded to criminal organizations that refused to acknowledge its territorial authority. The Hells Angels had built their Canadian presence starting in 1977, when the Popeyes Motorcycle Club in Sorel, Quebec, patched over to become the first Canadian chapter. Through the Quebec Biker War of 1994 to 2002, an 8-year conflict with the Rock Machine that produced 162 dead and 84 bombings and turned Montreal into one of the most violent organized crime environments in the Western world. During that period, the Angels had established themselves as the dominant criminal force in the province's drug distribution network. The franchise model they implemented across Quebec produced what Canadian investigators described as a criminal corporation. Chapters holding exclusive territories, street-level gangs paying a 10% tithe on their drug revenues, and the entire system enforced through the systematic violence that the Angels had spent 50 years perfecting. By 2025, that model was under the most direct assault it had faced since the Rock Machine. A new generation of criminal organizations, the Blood Family Mafia, Arab Power, and others, had decided that the biker tax was an extortion racket they were unwilling to pay. This had happened before, with organizations that had eventually been brought back into the franchise structure through violence. What was different in 2025 was the willingness of the new organizations to use visible, public violence as a counter-deterrent to film acts of violence against Angels members and post those videos on social media as recruitment tools and intimidation signals simultaneously. The Angels had always enforced their authority through the threat of violence that everyone knew was real, but that was conducted with as much operational discretion as possible. The new organizations were doing the opposite, making the violence as visible as possible, because visibility was itself a form of power in the social media environment they operated in. The Sûreté du Québec's 160+ raids in February 2026, specifically targeting Hells Angels distribution networks, were in significant part a consequence of the visibility that the Angels' conflict with non-paying criminal organizations had generated. The conflict that was supposed to enforce the franchise model had, instead, produced the law enforcement attention that threatened the franchise itself. That was the dynamic, the challenge to territorial authority, producing the visibility that produced the investigation, that damaged the very structure the enforcement was designed to protect, that most closely paralleled what Tren de Aragua's American presence represented to the Angels in the United States. The pattern in Canada was the template. Criminal organizations that refuse to acknowledge the established hierarchy do not simply disappear when the Angels apply pressure. They fight back, they generate attention, and they force the Angels into exactly the kind of visible conflict that the franchise model was designed to avoid. The biker war that was supposed to establish dominance ends up producing federal investigations that threaten everything the dominance was built to protect. In Quebec, the Angels were learning this lesson in real time. In the United States, the lesson was available to anyone paying attention to what the arrival of Tren de Aragua in Angels-controlled geography actually meant for the Angels' institutional interests. The most illuminating parallel to the Hells Angels situation with Venezuelan gangs was not happening in Colorado or New York in September 2024. It was happening in Quebec, Canada, where the Angels franchise model was facing the most direct and most documented challenge in the organization's Canadian history, and where the nature of that challenge revealed exactly how the club responded to criminal organizations that refused to acknowledge its territorial authority. The Hells Angels had built their Canadian presence starting in 1977, when the Popeyes Motorcycle Club in Sorel, Quebec, patched over to become the first Canadian chapter. Through the Quebec Biker War of 1994 to 2002, an 8-year conflict with the Rock Machine that produced 162 dead and 84 bombings and turned Montreal into one of the most violent organized crime and environments in the Western world. During that period, the Angels had established themselves as the dominant criminal force in the province's drug distribution network. The franchise model they implemented across Quebec produced what Canadian investigators described as a criminal corporation, chapters holding exclusive territories, street-level gangs paying a 10% tithe on their drug revenues, and the entire system enforced through the systematic violence that the Angels had spent 50 years perfecting. By 2025, that model was under the most direct assault it had faced since the Rock Machine. The Blood family, mafia, and Arab power had decided the bike attacks was an extortion racket they were unwilling to pay. What distinguished these organizations from previous challengers was not just their willingness to refuse, it was their willingness to make the refusal public. They filmed acts of violence against Angels members and associates and posted those videos on social media. They turned the escalation itself into a recruitment tool and an intimidation signal, operating in a media environment that the Angels, with their carefully cultivated institutional distance from public attention, had never navigated and had no established response to. The Angels had always enforced their authority through violence that was real but conducted with operational discretion. The new organizations were inverting that model entirely: maximum visibility, maximum public aggression, the violence itself as the message. The Sûreté du Québec's 160 plus raids in February 2026, specifically targeting Hells Angels distribution networks, were in significant part a consequence of the visibility that the conflict had generated. The enforcement of the franchise model had produced the law enforcement environment that threatened the franchise itself. That was the dynamic challenge: producing visibility, producing investigation, producing structural damage that most closely paralleled what Tren de Aragua's American presence represented to the Angels in the United Damage. In Quebec, the Angels were learning the lesson in documented real time. In the United States, the lesson was available to anyone paying attention to what happened when a new criminal organization arrived in Angels-controlled geography with no interest in acknowledging the hierarchy the Angels had built. The truth that nobody talks about. The title of this script promises a truth that nobody talks about. Here it is, stated as plainly as the documented record allows. The viral story of September 2024, the Hells Angels riding to save Colorado from Venezuelan gangsters, was false in every detail. The bikers in the videos were not Hells Angels. They were not heading to Colorado. The Hells Angels denied involvement completely and credibly. The gang takeover of Aurora apartment buildings was, as the police chief repeatedly stated, despite sustained political pressure to say otherwise, not a gang takeover. The story that millions of people shared, that inflamed the national conversation about immigration and law enforcement, that generated enough political energy to influence a presidential campaign, was built entirely from misrepresented footage and social media amplification. But the viral story revealed a genuine and important truth by accident. It revealed how completely the public narrative about both organizations had been captured by political mythology that served everyone's purposes except understanding. The Hells Angels were cast as populist heroes, rough men who would do what the government wouldn't, defenders of American communities, the last line of protection when institutions had failed. This characterization required treating as fiction 7 decades of documented criminal history. The Angels are a criminal enterprise. They manufacture and distribute methamphetamine, cocaine, and other narcotics across state and international lines. They commit murder for hire. They run prostitution networks. They engage in money laundering, weapons trafficking, extortion, and every other revenue stream that the Federal Criminal Code prohibits. The Denver chapter of the Hells Angels, the chapter that was supposedly riding to save Colorado, was itself under active federal investigation for exactly those activities in the same period when the viral story placed them as Aurora's protectors. They are not heroes. They are not vigilantes. They are a criminal organization that has spent 75 years building the most sophisticated criminal franchise in the history of the outlaw motorcycle world. Tren de Aragua was cast as an invading army, organized, militarized, centrally directed, specifically designed to occupy American communities and terrorize their residents. This characterization required treating as irrelevant the assessments of law enforcement agencies in the specific cities where the gang's American operations were most documented. The NYPD's assessment was phone snatching and retail theft. Aurora's police chief repeatedly stated there was no takeover. The FBI's own analysts expressed skepticism about the degree of centralized control that the political narrative attributed to the gang's American cells. Tren de Aragua is genuinely dangerous. The federal designations as both a transnational criminal organization and a foreign terrorist organization reflect documented criminal activity across multiple countries involving murder, sex trafficking, and drug distribution. But dangerous is not the same as omnipresent. Violent is not the same as militarily organized. A criminal network that exploits vulnerable migrants and commits serious crimes in American cities is a serious law enforcement problem. It is not an invasion. The truth that nobody talked about was this: two criminal organizations that the political narrative positioned as opposites were actually operating in the same criminal ecosystem, competing for the same markets, generating the same kind of federal scrutiny, and presenting the same kind of challenge to the communities caught between them. The Hells Angels were not going to save Aurora from Tren de Aragua. They had their own federal case in Denver. They had their own drug trafficking networks in the same state, the same territory, the same communities. They were not the cavalry. They were, from the perspective of law enforcement, trying to address organized crime in Colorado, another part of the same problem. That is the truth that nobody talked about in September 2024, not because it was hidden. It was all in the public record: the federal indictments, the DEA investigations, the State Department designations, the police chief's press conferences. It was not talked about because it was not useful to anyone's political narrative. The Angels as heroes required ignoring the Angels' criminal record. Tren de Aragua, as an invasion, required ignoring the police departments saying otherwise. The truth was inconvenient in the specific way that truths about criminal organizations almost always are. It implicated everyone and exonerated no one. The intersection of these two organizations, one that has existed for 75 years and built the most sophisticated outlaw criminal franchise in the world, one that grew from a Venezuelan prison in 2014 and followed the wreckage of a country's collapse across 2 continents, is not a story about heroes and villains. It is a story about what criminal organizations do when they occupy the same geography. They compete, they negotiate, they generate federal attention, and they damage the communities that have the misfortune of being in between them. The social media story was satisfying precisely because it simplified all of that. Good bikers, bad immigrants, a confrontation with a clear winner. Reality was less satisfying and considerably more complicated. Subscribe and hit the bell. There are more investigations like this one coming.